Most people hear the word and picture one man, a turban, a fist raised against the West, a face on a protest banner. But an Ayatollah is not a person. It is a rank inside one of the oldest and most complex clerical systems on Earth. A system where no pope appoints you, no board confirms you, and no government gives you a certificate. You earn the title the same way a scholar earns respect in any tradition that predates the modern world. Slowly, publicly, over decades, through the consensus of people who have spent their lives studying alongside you. And almost no one outside the system understands how it actually works. The word itself is Arabic. Ayatollah, Ayat Allah, means sign of God. It sounds grand, and it was meant to be. For most of its history, only a handful of scholars alive at any given time carried the title. These were men who had devoted 20, 30, sometimes 40 years to the study of Islamic jurisprudence inside the Hawza, the Shia seminary system, and emerged with a reputation so formidable that other scholars simply began referring to them that way. There was no ceremony, no diploma hung on a wall. The community decided. Think of it less like being ordained and more like being recognized. The way a small town knows who its real doctor is before anyone checks a license. But before we get to what an Ayatollah does, we need to understand the world that produces one. The Hawza is not a single school. It is an entire educational ecosystem, a network of seminaries, study circles, and scholarly households concentrated primarily in two cities, Najaf in southern Iraq and Qom in central Iran. Najaf's Hawza is the older of the two, founded in the 11th century near the shrine of Imam Ali. Qom's modern seminary dates only to 1922, though Shia scholarship existed in the city for 1,000 years before that. Between them, these two institutions have shaped the intellectual and spiritual life of Shia Islam for generations. At its peak in the 1960s, Najaf alone had 20,000 students. Under Saddam Hussein's persecution, the number dropped to roughly 3,000. Since 2003, it has climbed back to around 13,000. Qom is larger still. Estimates suggest nearly 300,000 clerics pass through Iran's seminaries at various levels. The numbers matter because they reveal something important. This is not a small priesthood. It is a vast scholarly community with its own economics, its own internal politics, its own centuries-old debates about the proper relationship between knowledge and power. A student entering the Hawza begins at the bottom. The Arabic term is Talib Ilm, a seeker of knowledge. The curriculum starts with grammar, not theology, not law, grammar. Arabic grammar and logic, because the entire tradition rests on the precise interpretation of classical texts, and you cannot interpret what you cannot parse. From there, a student moves into jurisprudence, legal theory, Quranic exegesis, theology, philosophy, and hadith sciences. The traditional method is not lecture-based in the modern university sense. It operates through three modes: direct oral transmission from teacher to student, peer-to-peer scholarly dialogue, and independent research. The relationship between teacher and student is understood as a covenant, not a transaction. There are three broad levels. The preliminary stage covers foundational texts, grammar, logic, and basic law. The intermediate stage engages more advanced works in jurisprudence and legal theory. The final stage, called Bath al-Kharij, which means beyond the text, is where a student moves past studying other scholars' conclusions and begins forming their own independent legal reasoning. Completing this stage typically takes at least 10 years of advanced study. In Najaf, roughly 200 fully trained clerics graduate each year. Not everyone finishes. Many study for 3 to 5 years and return home to serve as local religious teachers or community guides. That is considered honorable, not a failure. The system does not demand that everyone reach the top. It demands that the journey be taken seriously at every level. Now, the ranks. At the lowest level, you are a student, talib ilm. Above that, a mujtahid, one qualified to exercise independent legal reasoning. This is the crucial threshold. A mujtahid has demonstrated through years of study and examination that he can derive legal rulings directly from Islamic sources rather than simply following someone else's conclusions. Above mujtahid sits the rank of Hujjatul Islam, proof of Islam. This was once a deeply prestigious title reserved for a small number of distinguished scholars. After the 1979 Iranian Revolution, it expanded dramatically in usage, and now functions more as a mid-level clerical designation. Then comes Ayatollah. Traditionally, this title was reserved for the most prominent mujtahids, scholars whose reputations had grown so large that other scholars and ordinary believers alike acknowledged them as authorities. By the 1960s, being called an Ayatollah generally meant you were also a marja, a source of emulation whom ordinary Shia Muslims would follow for guidance on matters of daily religious life. But the system reveals a tension that echoes through every tradition we have studied on this channel. Titles inflate. After the Iranian Revolution, the title of Ayatollah expanded to include any established mujtahid, and then it expanded further to include anyone who had passed their final seminary examinations. By 2015, there were thousands of Ayatollahs. The title that once belonged to a handful had become common. The response was the same one every tradition reaches for when a distinction loses its edge: create a new one. The title Grand Ayatollah, Ayatollah al-Uzma, which means Great Sign of God, emerged to distinguish the most senior scholars from the growing crowd. At first, perhaps half a dozen carried the title. In recent years, more than 50 claim it. At the very top of this system sits the Marja al-Taqlid, the source of emulation. This is the figure that most people outside the tradition never learn about, and it is arguably the most important. Every Shia Muslim who is not themselves a trained jurist is expected to choose a living marja and follow his rulings on matters of religious practice. Not historical rulings, not rulings from a book written centuries ago. The rulings of a living, breathing scholar who is interpreting Islamic law for the conditions of the present day. When that marja dies, you choose a new one. The law is always alive, because the interpreter must always be alive. The marja publishes a risalah, a comprehensive manual of practical rulings covering everything from prayer and fasting to business ethics, marriage, diet, and medical decisions. If you cannot find the answer in the manual, you write to your marja's office or increasingly check his website and receive a ruling. Millions of Shia Muslims around the world structure their daily lives around this relationship. No one appoints a marja. There is no election, no committee, no formal process of any kind. A scholar becomes a marja when a critical mass of other scholars and ordinary believers begin treating him as one. He teaches the most advanced classes. Students gather. His legal reasoning is cited by others. His reputation spreads from the seminary to the bazaar, from the bazaar to other cities, from other cities to other countries. The community, over years, settles on who it trusts. If that sounds familiar, if it sounds like the way an Amish community decides which interpretation of the ordnung carries the most weight, or how a bishop's authority rests not on a title but on the lived respect of the people around him, that is because it is the same underlying logic. Authority flows upward from the community. It is granted, not seized. The system funds itself through a mechanism that has no exact parallel in Western religion. It is called khums, literally 1/5. Every Shia Muslim is obligated to pay 20% of their annual surplus income the money left after all legitimate living expenses, as a religious tax. Half of this goes to support the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad who are in need. The other half, called the share of the imam, is given to the marja of one's choice, who then uses it to fund seminaries, support students, maintain religious institutions, and provide welfare. This means the Hawza system, unlike many religious institutions, operates largely independent of government funding. In Najaf, this independence has been fiercely guarded. The seminary has sustained itself through community donations and comes for nearly 1,000 years, surviving Mongol invasions, Ottoman rule, British colonialism, Saddam Hussein's persecution, and the chaos that followed the 2003 American invasion of Iraq. The money flows from believer to scholar. The scholar answers to the believers who chose him. The economic structure creates a form of accountability that is organic rather than bureaucratic. A marja who loses the trust of his followers loses his income. A marja who is seen as wise, just, and accessible gains followers and the resources to expand his scholarly network. The system self-corrects in the same quiet, ungoverned way that Amish communities self-correct when a bishop drifts too far from what the people around him will accept. And yet, within this tradition, there is a fault line, and it is one of the most consequential disagreements in the modern world. For most of Shia history, the senior clergy practiced what scholars call quietism. The reasoning was theological. Since the 12th Imam, the divinely appointed leader of the Muslim community, went into occultation in the 9th century, no human government could claim full Islamic legitimacy. The scholar's role was to guide believers in matters of faith and law, not to govern states. They advised rulers, they sometimes opposed rulers, but they did not seek to become rulers. This was the tradition that the Hawza of Najaf embodied for centuries. In 1970, an exiled cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini, living in Najaf and studying in its libraries but becoming increasingly radical in his thinking, delivered a series of lectures that broke sharply from this tradition. He argued that Islamic jurists should not merely advise governments, but should run them. His theory, called velayat-e-faqih, or guardianship of the jurist, proposed that a single supreme scholar should hold ultimate political authority over the state until the return of the 12th Imam. It was, by the standards of Shia clerical tradition, revolutionary and deeply controversial. The most senior Shia scholar alive at the time, Grand Ayatollah Abu al-Qasim al-Khouei, rejected the idea outright. He held that the faqih's guardianship was limited in scope to care for orphans, widows, and the vulnerable, and could not be stretched to encompass political rule. Of the dozen grand ayatollahs alive at the time of the 1979 Iranian Revolution, only one, besides Khomeini, endorsed the concept. But Khomeini's revolution succeeded, and in 1979, Velayat-e-Faqih was written into the constitution of the new Islamic Republic of Iran, a system that had operated for 1,000 years on the organic, bottom-up consensus of scholars and communities was, in one country, fused with the apparatus of a modern state. The consequences have defined the region ever since. Today, the Shia clerical world is split between two poles, centered in two cities barely 500 miles apart. In Najaf, Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, widely regarded as the most followed marja in the world, maintains the traditional approach. He does not endorse clerical rule. He has supported civil democratic governance in Iraq, while intervening only in moments of existential crisis. His authority rests entirely on scholarly reputation and the voluntary loyalty of millions. In QOM, the Iranian seminary system is intertwined with state power. The Supreme Leader's office controls resources, appoints commissars within religious institutions, and uses the machinery of government to amplify its clerical authority. Scholarly credentials and political loyalty have become entangled in ways that traditional seminary culture never intended. Both cities produce brilliant scholars. Both sustain vast networks of learning and community support. But they answer a fundamentally different question about what religious authority is for. This is the system behind the word. When someone says Ayatollah, they are pointing at a single tile in a mosaic that stretches back more than 1,000 years. Behind that tile is a seminary system older than most European universities. There is a funding mechanism that makes the clergy financially accountable to ordinary believers. There is a scholarly hierarchy built on consensus rather than appointment. There is a tradition of independent legal reasoning that expects every generation to produce scholars capable of interpreting ancient texts for modern life. And there is a living, unresolved debate about whether the role of the scholar is to guide a community or to govern a nation. Most of the world sees only the political surface, the turban on the balcony, the fatwa on the news ticker. Underneath is something far older, far more complex, and far more human. A community of scholars arguing about the right way to live, the same argument every close community has, in every tradition, in every century. The answers differ. The argument is the same. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing. We explore the systems, traditions, and hidden structures behind the communities the world talks about but rarely understands. Hit that subscribe button and stay with us.